You know, when I was a kid, I don't think I had ever heard the word recycle. They probably hadn't invented that word yet, but I understood the idea behind that word perfectly because no one in the world was better than my mom at getting the most use out of everything. My mother would even reuse the dirt that we kids would track into the house on the bottoms of our shoes. It's true. After she cleaned the house, she would leave the dirt she had swept up in a box beside the door, and she would make us carry it back out to the fields and scatter it around. My mom would say, "As poor as the soil is around here, we can't afford to have you kids tracking the fertilizer from the fields into the house on the bottoms of your shoes." Of course, if you think about it, when we carried the dirt back out to the field, we got more dirt on the bottoms of our shoes. My mom wasn't right about everything, but she was really right that the soil around our end of the county was poor. Hardly anything would grow in that dirt, except for beans. For some reason, beans always did fine. And there was one year when I was a kid when that was the only thing anybody could grow. Nothing but beans. And so that's all anyone had to eat that year. It wouldn't have been so bad if there had been something to go along with the beans, but you couldn't make any money by selling your beans because that's all the neighbors had too. There were so many times when I sat down at the table wishing there would be something to add a little bit of interest to the beans I was about to eat. The whole family felt the same way I did, but especially my grandpa. My grandpa had lived most of his life back east, where the soil is deep and loamy and you can grow all kinds of vegetables in it. But ever since he came out west to live with us, he got one thing to eat morning, noon, and night. Nothing but beans. And then my dad decided to take a big risk. He filled up several sacks with beans and he loaded them into the pickup and he drove until finally he came to a place where beans were not so plentiful. He was able to sell the beans and then come back home. But with all the expense of traveling out and traveling back, he did not make much profit from his venture. In fact, when he went to the store to spend his earnings, all he could afford to buy was a big ham bone. He brought the ham bone home, and when the next Sunday came around, my mom used that ham bone to flavor our beans for Sunday dinner. I'll never forget that Sunday dinner as long as I live. And I don't have to tell you, my grandpa enjoyed it the most. He took one taste of those beans and he hollered, "Hallelujah!" And by the time the rest of us were half finished with our beans, he had cleaned his plate and was asking for another helping. But of course, being the economical person she was, my mom did not leave the ham bone in the pot the whole time the beans were cooking. She left it there for a short while and then she took it out and she hung it on the clothesline to dry. When the next Sunday came around, she used it again to flavor up our beans for Sunday dinner. Grandpa hollered, "Hallelujah!" and he ate 3 helpings of those beans. But then my mom dried out the ham bone and used it again the next week. She used it again the following week. And then somehow the neighbors found out about our ham bone. One day Mrs. Gillespie came by and she asked if she could borrow the ham bone. Her oldest son was going to get home from the army that day. She wanted to have a nice meal waiting for him. You know, kind of a hero's welcome. Of course, my mom said she could use the ham bone, but she had to promise she'd only leave it in the pot for a short time and then she'd dry it out really well. And my mom also suggested that she should invite Grandpa to come for dinner. Grandpa hollered, "Hallelujah," and off he went with Mrs. Gillespie. Well, it wasn't very long before our ham bone would be gone 3 or 4 days out of the week. Every time there was a special occasion in some family, birthdays, baptisms, wedding anniversaries, folks would come by and borrow our ham bone. My mom got to be a pretty important person around our end of the county just because of that ham bone. And my grandpa would always manage to wrangle an invitation to dinner with whatever family was serving beans flavored up with the ham bone. And then one Saturday, Mrs. McIvy came by. She lived about a mile down our road. Her daughter was getting married, and she wanted to borrow the ham bone to make a nice wedding supper. Of course, my mom told her she could use the ham bone, and of course, Mrs. McIvy invited Grandpa to come to the wedding. Grandpa hollered, "Hallelujah," and he ran out to the well to wash his face. Grandpa was pulling the bucket up out of the well when he felt a tickle in his nose and he sneezed. And his false teeth went flying out of his mouth and fell into the well. My grandpa gave a holler. We all came running to see what the problem was. He pointed down the well. Sure enough, in the little circle of sunlight at the bottom of the well, we could see Grandpa's false teeth grinning up at us out of the water. We didn't know what to do. The well was too narrow for anybody to climb down. And if we didn't get my grandpa's false teeth out of there, where could we find the money to buy him another set? Oh, but my brother Stan, he was the scientist of the family. He came up with an idea. He ran back to the house. He said, "Mrs. McIvy, don't take the ham bone yet. I need it for something." He brought the ham bone out to the well and he tied it onto a fishing line. He lowered it down into the well and kind of dangled it in front of Grandpa's false teeth. And do you know, those false teeth had grown so fond of eating beans flavored with that ham bone, they opened right up and clamped onto it. My brother reeled in the fishing line. Up came Grandpa's false teeth, fastened tight to the ham bone. The whole family hollered, "Hallelujah!" But you know, the false teeth were fastened so tight to the ham bone, we had a terrible time trying to pry them loose. And in the tug of war we were having with the false teeth, the fishing line snapped. And that sudden jerk startled the false teeth. They opened their grip on the ham bone, and the ham bone fell into the well. Well, I wanted to tie Grandpa's false teeth onto the fishing line and lower them down and get that ham bone out of there. But my dad said we'd better not do that. If the fishing line should happen to break, Grandpa's false teeth would end up fastened tight to the ham bone at the bottom of the well forever. We could all see he was right about that. Mrs. McIvy was terribly disappointed. Well, half the county was disappointed for that matter. It was like the end of an era. But do you know, up until the time I grew up and left home, folks would come by and get water from our well to cook their beans in. They always said beans cooked in that water had a little special taste to them. They wouldn't come right out and say they tasted like ham. That would be stretching things a bit. And folks around there didn't ever exaggerate the truth. But they would have a little special flavor to them. There's absolutely no denying that. Folks would take one bite of beans flavored with that water and they would holler, "Hallelujah!"